Sherlock Holmes is awakened by a mystery at dawn. A teacup, once steaming, now cold and abandoned. In its silence lies the first clue to a crime that daylight alone cannot hide. Chapter 1. The impossible crime. May have always maintained that there is no limit to the imaginative cruelty of man, nor to the subtle methods by which he may choose to conceal it. Yet in all my years at Baker Street watching the mind of Sherlock Holmes dissect truth from fabrication, I never encountered a case so quietly chilling, so impeccably engineered, as that of the cold teacup discovered at dawn. It began with a knock at our door, soft, deliberate, and oddly precise. It was the 5th of May, and the London dawn had broken reluctantly over a sky that had forgotten how to shine. Holmes and I had risen early, owing to his restless sleep the night before, punctuated by violin strains too mournful for even Chopin. He claimed it was damp. Mrs. Hudson answered the door, and in came Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, his thin frame wrapped in a damp greatcoat, face pale beneath a brim of rain. "Holmes," he said gravely, removing his hat, "I wouldn't have come so early if it weren't for how confused this one is." Holmes rose from his chair like a cat stretching into consciousness. "Your manner, Lestrade, is far too theatrical for a simple burglary or late-night quarrel. Sit." "Tea." Lestrade declined, though his fingers twitched for warmth. "It's at Brookwood Manor. Lord Benedict Collingwood. You've heard of him, no doubt." Holmes' eyebrow rose a fraction. "An antiquarian, collector of Mesopotamian artifacts, retired, diplomat, widower, no children, known for throwing tedious parties filled with people who hate each other politely. Continue." Lestrade looked faintly annoyed but pressed on. "This morning, at precisely 5 o'clock, a maid entered the drawing room and found Collingwood dead in his armchair, not slump-seated, upright, as if asleep. A cup of Earl Grey rested on the side table beside him, untouched. Natural causes, perhaps, I offered. "I thought so too, Doctor," said Lestrade, "until we learned the tea had been poured at exactly 2 minutes past 3. Holmes' fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And the house?" "Locked tight from the inside. Windows bolted. No sign of forced entry. Only for other people in the house, his nephew, the maid, the butler, and a young scholar staying the night, all asleep in locked rooms. The maid swears she made the tea herself and delivered it at precisely 3 o'clock. Lord Collingwood had asked not to be disturbed afterward, when she returned at 5. The tea was cold, and he was dead." Holmes' eyes glinted. "Then we are left with a dead man, a locked room, and a teacup grown cold in the night. Curious. Here's the oddest bit," Lestrade added. "There's no sign of poison. The man simply stopped." Holmes rose, now fully alert, as though the fog in the room had lifted for him alone. "Let us walk. Watson, I believe the rain has softened enough. Inspector, we will accompany you to Brookwood. At once, of course. After all, nothing chills the truth like delay, and we already have one cold cup too many." Brookwood Manor stood like a graying spectre on the edge of Hampstead Heath, a house better suited to secrets than to people. Fog lay around it like a strangler's fingers, and the rain had done little to make it feel less sepulchral. It was not yet 7. We were led by the butler, a silent man named Hargrove, into the drawing room. Lord Collingwood sat precisely as described, back straight, head resting slightly against the velvet of the chair. His eyes were closed, not in agony, but in something that resembled sleep or surrender. Beside him, on a small silver tray, rested the teacup. Holmes examined it without touching. No crack in the porcelain. A fine rim. Japanese, mid-Meiji era, unusual choice for Collingwood. He preferred Turkish silver. Holmes bent low, peering beneath the chair and along the floorboards. "No signs of struggle," I noted aloud. "Quite." Watson observed the man's fingers, I looked, relaxed, no signs of convulsion or tension. Precisely. And the face peaceful, almost peaceful, as if he had no warning of death at all. Holmes turned to Lestrade. Was he known to take medication? Lestrade consulted his notebook. Nothing regular. Bit of arthritis, nothing more. Holmes tapped his chin, then turned to the maid, a young woman named Clara. She stood near the hallway, wringing her apron. You delivered the tea at 3? Yes, sir. Just after the clock struck. Did you speak to him? He said thank you, Clara, and asked not to be disturbed for the rest of the morning. Did he drink? No. I watched as I set the tray. He was writing a letter and barely looked up. A letter. Holmes' eyes sharpened. Yes, on that desk over there. Holmes crossed the room swiftly, scanned the desk, and found the letter and finished, its final line trailing into nothing. Dearest Emily, the burden grows heavier by the day. I fear that what I've discovered may finally. The rest was absent. The ink had dried. Yet the quill still rested in the inkwell, untouched since. Holmes stared at the words, unmoving. I felt the tension coil in the air. Who is Emily? Holmes asked without turning. The nephew, a tall man in his 30s named Reginald Collingwood, stepped forward. His jaw was clenched tightly. His wife's sister. She died years ago. He spoke of her often. She was a comfort to him after the war. And who is this young scholar mentioned by the inspector? Holmes asked, shifting his gaze. A thin, scholarly man with spectacles too large for his face stepped forward. William Dunthorpe, sir. I'm a student of Near Eastern history. Lord Collingwood was sponsoring my research. I've been staying here for a fortnight. Holmes turned back to the teacup, his eyes narrowing. Watson, he said softly, when you die of fright, what would you expect the body to show? Signs of trauma, at least. Cardiac strain. Perhaps an expression of terror. This shows none. Precisely. The man died without struggle, without pain, and without expectation. Yet something was coming. Something dreadful enough to begin. That letter and never finish it. He straightened, brushing invisible dust from his coat. This is not a matter of medicine, Watson. This is a matter of psychology, of anticipation. Do you believe he was murdered? I asked. I believe, Holmes said slowly, that the man was killed by something that required no violence, no poison, and no force, merely presence. Lestrade frowned. What does that mean, Holmes? Holmes' eyes glimmered darkly. It means, Lestrade, that we are dealing with a murder executed in silence, under the disguise of peace. He turned back to the room, scanning the faces. And somewhere in this house, the person who delivered death without lifting a hand still walks freely. He paused. Then, with that cool detachment that often made him terrifying, he added, Come, Watson, let us see what warmth remains in this house of cold tea. Chapter 2. A discussion in the morning fog. The fog had thickened by the time Holmes and I stepped out of Brookwood Manor. It lay upon the heath like a great woolen shroud, muting every sound, distorting every shape, and making the early hour feel as though night had only grudgingly loosened its grip. We walked in silence for some time, Holmes striding ahead with his hands clasped behind his back, head bowed slightly as if in prayer. The rain had ceased, but the damp remained, settling into coat collars and eyelashes, as persistent and inescapable as the questions churning in my mind. At last, unable to contain my thoughts any longer, I cleared my throat and spoke. Well, Holmes, you've seen the body, the room, the teacup. What are we to make of it? Holmes didn't answer immediately. His boots struck the gravel path with methodical precision, but I could see the subtle energy beginning to build in him, like a hound catching the faintest scent on the wind. At first glance, he murmured, we are presented with a classic, locked room mystery. A man dead with no wound, no sign of struggle, and no apparent cause. The doors were locked, the windows secured, and the occupants accounted for. Indeed, I replied, which would seem to leave only natural causes. He stopped walking and turned to face me. His eyes gray, sharp, and shining had taken on that singular focus I had come to recognize as the herald of obsession. And yet, Watson, you forget the single most telling detail in that room. The teacup, I ventured. Exactly so. It was untouched. That in itself is not unusual. But why was it untouched? Collingwood asked not to be disturbed. He had every intention of drinking that tea. He even thanked the maid as she said it. Down, perhaps he became distracted, I suggested. The letter, perhaps, or fatigue. Holmes turned away and began pacing slowly again. No, the tea was important. It was a ritual. The maid confirmed it, every morning at precisely 3 o'clock. He took his Earl Grey. He would not have ignored it without cause. You believe something prevented him. I believe this was orchestrated, Holmes said. Murder, yes, but by methods most unconventional, which makes our suspect all the more dangerous. We turned off the path and made our way down the main road, the early morning clatter of a milk cart the only sound that accompanied us. I presume you noted the final line of the letter, Holmes asked. What I've discovered may finally, yes, ominous. Perhaps he had uncovered a secret or a threat. Perhaps he intended to warn someone. Emily, I said, remembering. His sister-in-law. Dead for years, Holmes replied. And yet the letter was addressed to her. Then perhaps he wrote it as a form of reflection. Some men do when grieving. Possible, Holmes allowed. But I do not believe the dead man was grieving. I believe he was frightened. He paused before adding, and frightened men do not sip tea, Watson. They cling to small rituals. As they wait for the hammer to fall, I felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Then you suspect someone in the house. I suspect everyone in the house, Holmes said with emphasis. The butler Hargrove's stillness was too perfect. The maid Clara nervous. Yes, but her account was rehearsed. And the nephew, that one bears watching. Reginald, I asked. He seemed tense, more than tense. Holmes replied. Guarded. Collingwood was wealthy, childless, and nearing the end of his life. One need not be a student of the law to imagine how his estate might tempt a relative. And the scholar? I asked, remembering the nervous man with his oversized spectacles. Dunthorpe is curious, Holmes mused. His presence in the house is recent, yet he was given remarkable access. Lord Collingwood was not known to host students so freely. And then there's the matter of the teacup itself. What about it? Holmes smiled thinly. The cup was chilled, Watson, but the saucer beneath it was warm. I stared at him. What does that mean? It means, he said, that the tea had been replaced at some point after it was poured. A silence stretched between us, filled only by the echo of distant hooves. Then I said, slowly, then the murderer not only entered the room unnoticed, but tampered with the scene, indeed, which tells us two things, that the killer was confident enough to alter the crime scene, and that they possessed knowledge of Collingwood's habits, intimate enough to time their movements precisely. He stopped and faced me once more. This was not a crime of passion, Watson. It was a performance executed with care, with knowledge, and with motive yet unclear. I said nothing. There was nothing to say. Holmes adjusted his coat, now visibly energized. We returned to Baker Street. I must send a wire to the archives of the British Museum, and then I wish to review Collingwood's will, his correspondence, and any dealings he had with foreign governments in the last 6 months. I looked at him, startled. You believe this goes beyond the house? Holmes gave a small, unreadable smile. Everything goes beyond the house, Watson. That is the essence of a well-built mystery. It begins in the drawing room and ends at the edge of the world. And with that, we turned toward the city, the fog swallowing us behind. Chapter 3. The first clues a scene of deception returned to Brookwood Manor that afternoon, the fog having lifted, though a grayness still clung to the world like the remnants of an uneasy dream. Holmes, after dispatching the telegrams from Baker Street and reading through a recent obituary column with unnerving intensity, had said little during our ride. His silence was not inattentive, it was the silence of calculation, of a mind reconstructing, a moment down to its smallest hinge. "I want to see the drawing room again," he said as we passed through the iron gates of the estate. "Alone, if possible. The truth is most visible when not forced to hide." We were greeted at the door once more by the butler, Hargrove, who inclined his head with solemn stiffness. "Inspector Lestrade has departed for the yard, but he left instructions that you are to be given full access. Mr. Holmes, excellent." Holmes replied without meeting the man's eyes. "And the others? Where are they?" "In their rooms, sir, awaiting further questioning." "Keep them there. Dr. Watson and I require a few minutes undisturbed in the drawing room." Hargrove bowed again and disappeared, as noiselessly as he had arrived. The moment we stepped into the drawing room, Holmes became transformed. His limbs took on a subtle energy, his eyes darting like those of a bird surveying a distant prey. I had seen this mood before he called it clearing the air. To me, it always seemed as though he were not merely observing a room, but listening to it. He approached the side table first. The now infamous Teacup sat precisely where we had last seen it, beneath its silver dome, guarded by a handkerchief Lestrade had placed over it, unmoved. Holmes muttered, removing the covering and inspecting the cup. Curious. He knelt beside the tray, examining the rim of the saucer again with his magnifying glass. He sniffed once at the lip of the cup and then pressed his fingers to the handle. Then he paused, straightened, and turned his gaze to the armchair where Lord Collingwood had died, still upright, still posed. "Watson, you will notice that the cushion behind the back has been plumped slightly." I approached and looked closer. "Yes, I suppose it does appear fluffed. But what of it?" Holmes moved to the other side of the chair. "It was not so this morning. The maid or someone else has made an adjustment, either to disguise something or to restore the image of peace. You suspect someone tampered with the body. Not quite the body, but perhaps the perception of the body. There is a subtle difference, and therein lies our game." He then moved to the desk, where the half-written letter remained. He read the final line again aloud. "What I've discovered may finally..." "Finally what?" Holmes whispered. "It is not merely a word of doom, it is a word of decision. He was going to act, but someone ensured he never did." He inspected the pen, the inkwell, the angle of the blotter, and even the lamp. Then, with sudden animation, he turned and strode to the fireplace. "Watson, fetch the fire. Irons." I obliged, though puzzled. Holmes stirred the ashes in the grate gently, sifting through the gray cinders with precision. After a moment, he paused and extracted a partially burned scrap of paper, blackened and curled. He handed it to me. Note: the edge torn cleanly, not crumpled. Part of a letter, perhaps. I squinted. The ink had bled, but a few words remained legible. "Collingwood Estate. Inheritance transfer, not yet notified." Holmes arched an eyebrow. Well, an unsent letter regarding the estate. Why destroy it unless someone had reason to fear its contents? I was about to answer when Holmes stiffened and tilted his head. Footsteps outside the drawing room, soft, hesitant. Then the sound of someone retreating quickly down the corridor. Holmes was at the door in 3 strides and flung it open. The hall was empty, save for a faint rustle of skirts vanishing. Up the stairwell. "The maid," Holmes murmured. "Clara. Why would she be listening?" "Because, Watson, the difference between a maid and a spy is simply a matter of purpose." We returned to the room, and Holmes crossed to the far wall where a portrait of Lady Collingwood, the late wife, hung in a heavy oak frame. He stared at it for a long moment. "Do you see it?" he asked. "See what?" "Why hang a portrait of the lady here? This is Collingwood's sanctuary, his drawing room, his writing desk, his morning tea, and yet he permits the gaze of his late wife to rest upon him always. It suggests guilt or devotion, or both." Holmes turned, satisfied. "Let us now revisit the facts we've gathered today," I nodded, mentally checking them off. 1. The tea was untouched, but the saucer was warm, suggesting the cup had been moved or replaced. 2. Holmes continued. The body was found perfectly poised, not just dead but arranged. 3. A burned letter indicating a planned change to the inheritance. 4. The half-written letter to Emily, implying discovery of something significant and fear. 5. A maid eavesdropping, and a butler to quiet to trust. 6. I added, a scholar who seems out of place and a nephew who stands to gain everything. Holmes nodded approvingly. The stage is set, the actors placed, but what remains unclear is the method. How does one kill without leaving a trace? Poison, I offered again. Something exotic, perhaps. Holmes shook his head. We shall know more when the postmortem is complete. For now, we must assume the body reveals nothing, which means the mind of the killer must. He looked at me, face composed, but eyes burning with thought. This was not just a murder, Watson. This was a message. The question is, to whom? At that moment, the door opened and Hargrove entered. His voice as dry as parchment. "Mr. Holmes, Mr. Dunthorpe asks if you would speak with him. He says it is urgent." Holmes nodded slowly. The scholar breaks his silence. "How convenient. Bring him here." As the butler turned to leave, Holmes added, almost as an afterthought, "And ask Miss Clara to remain downstairs. I believe she has more to share than just tea." We waited in silence, both of us now alert. Holmes stood by the window, his silhouette tall and lean against the dimming afternoon light. "This is only the first movement," he said softly. "The melody has yet to reveal its theme." Chapter 4. The gathering of suspects. William Dunthorpe entered the drawing room with the anxious gait of a man who had not slept, or perhaps had slept too poorly. His coat was too large for his narrow frame, and his hands seemed unsure of where they belonged, hovering between the buttons and pockets, like frightened birds. He offered a tight nod to Holmes and me before sitting gingerly on the edge of the armchair, opposite the fireplace, the very seat where Lord Collingwood had met his death only hours prior. Holmes did not sit. He stood before the hearth like a schoolmaster preparing to examine a reluctant pupil. "You asked to speak with me," Holmes said without preamble. Dunthorpe swallowed hard. "Yes, I know I should have come forward sooner, but I wasn't certain, and after this morning, after the inspector left, I couldn't keep it to myself." Holmes said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch. "I came down from my room late last night," Dunthorpe said, "round 2 o'clock. I had been reading in bed, and I remembered I'd left one of my books downstairs, a rare Sumerian translation that Lord Collingwood had lent me. I didn't want to misplace it." Holmes' eyes narrowed slightly. "And where did you go?" Dunthorpe's face reddened. "I realize that, which is why I've come forward now." Holmes said nothing more to him. Instead, he turned to Hargrove, who had returned and stood just inside the door. "Please ask everyone in the house to join us here. I wish to speak with them together." "How so?" Hargrove shifted. He seemed troubled. He kept checking the grandfather clock in the hall, as though waiting for something. Holmes absorbed the answer, then faced them all once more. "One among you may have information you are withholding, perhaps out of fear or guilt or loyalty, but I assure you the truth will come to light, whether by your own will or mine." He paused. "Until then, I ask that none of you leave the house. Scotland Yard will make the arrangement formal. Dr. Watson and I will be staying nearby, If any of you remember anything, a sound, a word, a movement, you will report it to me directly." With that, Holmes stepped away, his eyes lingering once more on the tea tray. "I have no doubt," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, "that someone here poured death as calmly as one pours cream." Chapter 5. First Suspects. The Red Herring Scotland Yard arrived the following morning in the form of Sergeant Wilkes, a solid, round-faced man who looked more suited to guarding a bakery than investigating a crime scene. Nevertheless, he took over the household with bureaucratic efficiency, sealing the doors, logging witness statements, and informing the staff that no one was to leave the estate without explicit permission. Holmes and I took up temporary lodging at a modest and a half-mile from Brookwood. Though the accommodations were humble, they suited Holmes, who valued privacy over comfort. That evening, after a silent supper and 2 pipes' worth of contemplative smoke, Holmes suddenly stirred. "Watson," he said, eyes still fixed on the swirling fog outside the inn window, "tell me your impressions of Reginald Collingwood." I leaned back in my chair, a disagreeable fellow, nervous, defensive, clearly suspicious of you. He doesn't seem grief-stricken by his uncle's death, more irritated by the inconvenience of it. Holmes nodded. "Indeed, he is the most obvious suspect." I raised an eyebrow. "You believe he did it?" Holmes turned slowly, his face unreadable. "No, I believe he wants to appear as if he didn't, but is far too obvious to be the culprit." I blinked. "Then why suspect him at all?" "Because every proper mystery begins with the wrong suspect," Holmes said. "And Reginald, poor fool, has made himself a walking invitation for suspicion." The following morning, Holmes requested another visit to Brookwood, specifically to speak with Reginald alone. Sergeant Wilkes, convinced that Reginald was the key to the case, readily agreed. We found Reginald in the morning room, sitting stiffly with a newspaper he clearly wasn't reading. When Holmes entered, he gave a theatrical sigh and set the paper down. "Here to accuse me again, Mr. Holmes?" Holmes smiled mildly. "Not at all. I am here to observe." Reginald frowned. "Observe what?" "How a man behaves when no one believes him guilty, but everyone assumes it." The young man narrowed his eyes. "You think I'm innocent, then?" Holmes took a seat opposite him. "I think you're arrogant, petulant, and greedy, but I do not believe you killed your uncle." Reginald seemed startled. He looked down, then slowly exhaled. "Well, that's unexpected." Holmes leaned in. "Tell me, Mr. Collingwood, what do you know about your uncle's collection?" Reginald hesitated. "Not much. He kept it locked away. Mesopotamian tablets, ancient relics, some kind of Sumerian death mask. He only ever showed it to academics." "Did he ever speak of selling it?" "No. He claimed it was priceless, said it would go to a museum when he died." Holmes nodded. "But you hoped otherwise." Reginald flushed. "I won't deny that. He had no heir. I've stood by him, helped him with estate matters. It wouldn't have been wrong to expect something in return. Did he promise you anything?" Reginald hesitated again. "He mentioned revisions, said he was finalizing arrangements." Clara's lips parted, then closed again. "Sometimes, bits and pieces. He would talk late at night, when he couldn't sleep. He spoke of regret, of people he trusted who had disappointed him." "Did he mention his nephew?" She swallowed. "Yes, he didn't trust him. He said Reginald was watching him, waiting." Holmes tilted his head. "Did he fear for his life?" Clara hesitated again. "Too long. No, I don't think so." Holmes stared at her for a moment. Then he said softly, "You were outside the drawing room at 3 o'clock. Her head snapped up. "What?" "You paused by the door. You listened. You feared what you might hear and feared more what might happen if you didn't." Clara's breath caught. "Not murder," Holmes continued, "but something else, a conversation, a meeting." She looked at the floor. "He said He was going to confront someone. He didn't say who, only that it had to happen at night, when the house was still. When did he tell you this? Yesterday afternoon. Holmes stepped back. Thank you, Clara. That is all for now. As we exited the room, I turned to him. Holmes, if Reginald isn't the killer, and Clara isn't lying, then who remains? Holmes said nothing, but there was a shadow in his eyes, now a new doubt forming, or perhaps an old one solidifying. The red herring has passed, he murmured. Now the true current begins. Chapter 6. The secret clue, a hidden inconsistency, was just after 6 when we returned to the inn. The spring dusk settling into a quiet mauve twilight. Holmes lit the fire himself, a rare indulgence, and stood staring into it as though searching for some ancient rune hidden in the flames. I did not disturb him. There was a stillness to his posture I had learned to interpret. It meant that the truth had drawn close, but not yet broken the surface. After several minutes, he turned from the fire, pulled his chair to the hearth, and gestured for me to sit opposite him. There is a flaw, he said finally, a tiny inconsistency, one so quiet it nearly went unnoticed. But it is the sort of inconsistency that murders often rest upon. I sat forward. Where? In the drawing room, Holmes replied. Specifically, in the arrangement of the tea service. I blinked. You're referring to the warm saucer. That was the first inconsistency. Yes, he said, but not the last. No, Watson, there's another detail. Something so simple that even the inspector missed it. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, folded slip of paper. This is a sketch I made of the tray the moment we entered the scene, he said, handing it to me. Now describe what you see. I examined the drawing. A silver tray, the porcelain cup resting on its saucer, and a small silver spoon placed beside it. The napkin folded neatly under the spoon. Holmes nodded slowly. And now consider, the tea was poured at 3. The maid claims the tray was assembled then and not touched again. Yes, but Watson, he said, voice low with meaning. The spoon was dry. I frowned. Dry, spotless, Holmes confirmed, untouched. Not a trace of condensation, not the slightest stain of tea or sugar. It had not been used. I thought for a moment, then shook my head. So he didn't stir his tea. Holmes' eyes gleamed, but he always did. The maid confirmed it in passing. Lord Collingwood drank his tea sweet, and he stirred it every morning. Now I understand, which means someone prepared the tea tray after he was dead but forgot to use the spoon. Holmes nodded. The killer attempted to recreate the scene, but they made a single, fatal error. They forgot the ritual, the very thing that gave the tray its authenticity, and replaced the scene with one of serenity. I added, to hide the violence of their act. Exactly. We sat in silence a moment longer, the weight of the realization sinking in. At length, I asked, who would have the time and the access to do all this unnoticed? Holmes rose and crossed to the window. Outside, the fog had returned in patches, clinging to the ground like smoke over a battlefield. There are only two possibilities, he said. The butler Hargrove, whose presence is constant but unobtrusive, or the scholar Dunthorpe, who knew the Lord's habits, studied him, and whose room lies nearest the stair. You discount Reginald for the moment. The mistake with the spoon tells me something. The killer did not understand the ritual fully. They knew of it, but not in its entirety. Reginald would have known his uncle's tea habits well. Dunthorpe, on the other hand, might have observed them, but only from a distance. Or Clara? Holmes considered it. She knew too much to have been the one to fake ignorance. Her account, I now believe, is largely honest, but she may know who did it and fears retribution. He turned from the window. But that is not the only inconsistency. There's more. Holmes walked to his desk and opened a leather folder he had brought from Baker Street. This arrived while we were at the manor, he said. A copy of Lord Collingwood's most recent banking correspondence. It reveals the significant withdrawals made over the last month, each for the sum of £500. I blinked. That's a substantial amount. Indeed. And both were withdrawn in cash. Did he explain why? In a note scribbled on the back of one withdrawal slip, for discretion, no paper trail. I stared. Blackmail, possibly, or payment for silence. Either way, it tells us Collingwood was engaged in some secret affair in the weeks before his death. Holmes folded the papers and slipped them back into the folder. I intend to find out who received that money and whether it bought silence, protection, or something altogether more sinister. Just then, there was a knock at the door of the inn. Holmes opened it to reveal a small boy, one of the street messengers Holmes occasionally employed. The lad handed him an envelope and departed without a word. Holmes opened it and scanned its contents. It's from the solicitor, he said. The amended will finalized 3 days before the murder. And look here. He handed me the document. My eyes fell on a line near the bottom. In the event of my passing, the full contents of the Brookwood collection shall be left not to the Collingwood family, but to Mr. William Dunthorpe, for donation to the British Museum. I stared at Holmes. The scholar inherits everything. Holmes smiled grimly. And thus, our inconsistency sharpens. Reginald had motive but not means. Dunthorpe had an opportunity, and now, as we see, he had motive as well. He walked to the fire and stirred the embers gently. One staged teacup, one unfinished letter, and one inheritance, all pointing to a man who pretends to know little but sees much. Holmes turned toward me. Tomorrow, Watson, we test our theory, and if I am right. He paused, the firelight flickering across his face. Then the killer is far cleverer than I first feared. Chapter 7. The crime grows stranger. The morning broke gray and unpromising. A stiff breeze tugged at the skeletal trees outside the inn, and a persistent drizzle clung to the windows, streaking them with thin rivulets that looked like tears. Holmes, unaffected by weather or fatigue, was already awake and dressed, his brow furrowed in quiet concentration as he read over a document spread across our breakfast table. I sat across from him, nursing my tea, now lukewarm and bitter, and ventured, "The will still troubles you?" "Not the will," Holmes replied absently. "The timing of it." He tapped the paper with one long finger. 3 days before the murder, Collingwood amends the will, redirecting his most prized collection to a man he had only known for 6 months. He does so quietly, without consulting his family. Why? Perhaps he trusted Dunthorpe. They seem to share a scholarly kinship. Kinship is not motive proof, Holmes muttered. But yes, that's one possibility. He folded the will and tucked it back into his coat. "Come, Watson. I wish to see the study again." Back at the manor, Inspector Lestrade met us at the front door, a faint grimace twisting his usually impassive face. "You've chosen an interesting moment to return, Mr. Holmes," he said, stepping aside to let us pass. "Oh," Holmes asked lightly, "something has occurred?" Lestrade led us down the corridor toward the study. "The maid, Nellie, she vanished last night. Left her room sometime after midnight. No one saw her leave, and the back gate was found unlocked this morning." Holmes slowed. "Curious, indeed. We were preparing to question her again today. Now she's vanished into the fog. Did she take anything with her? Only her coat and her boots. No bag. Nothing from the house, so far as we can tell." "She was frightened," Holmes said quietly. "You believe someone threatened her?" Lestrade asked. Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he turned down the corridor, his steps quickening. In the study, the atmosphere had subtly changed. The fire was cold. A few papers had been disturbed on the desk. Holmes's gaze scanned the room with deliberate slowness. He moved to the hearth and crouched, running a gloved finger along the iron grate. Then he inspected the cold ash, lifting a few flecks and rubbing them between his fingers. "Well?" I asked. "There's been a fire since we were last here," Holmes said. "A small one, enough to burn a few documents." Lestrade crossed his arms. "And how would you know that?" "Because the ash is recent undisturbed, white at the edges. The rest is gray, aged, and compacted. Also," he pointed to a scorched corner of paper nestled deep in the grate. "That ink was modern, part of a ledger." "Likely." Lestrade moved to the fireplace and peered inside. "Someone burned evidence." Holmes stood. "Or a letter, or notes from Lord Collingwood's desk." His eyes fell on a wastepaper basket near the corner of the desk. He retrieved it and appended it on the rug, among the crumpled pages and scraps. A half-burnt envelope caught his eye. Holmes opened it carefully. Inside was a charred slip of thick paper with one legible line. "Discretion can no longer protect you." I felt a chill pass through me. Holmes read the fragment again, then handed it to Lestrade. "Tell me, Inspector, was there anyone else in the house last night? Anyone who might have had access to this room?" Lestrade hesitated. "The housekeeper, Mrs. Flynn, claimed to hear footsteps around 2 in the morning. She thought it was one of the guests using the lavatory." Holmes turned to me. "And what time was the fog at its thickest?" "Between midnight and dawn," I answered. "The innkeeper mentioned it when I rose." Holmes nodded. "Perfect conditions for slipping out unseen, either to flee or to make a second move." He turned and strode quickly from the room. Downstairs, Holmes requested to see Mr. Dunthorpe again. The scholar met us in the parlor, his expression pale and distracted. A leather-bound notebook was clenched in one hand, the other fiddling absently with his spectacles. "I heard about Nellie," he said as he sat. "Terrible business. She seemed so timid, harmless." "Sometimes it's the timid ones who see the most," Holmes replied. "She may have feared for her life." Dunthorpe shifted uncomfortably. "You think she knew something?" Holmes did not answer directly. Instead, he asked, "Did you speak with Lord Collingwood in the hours before his death?" I did." "Yes," Dunthorpe said. "Briefly, after supper, we discussed the Mesopotamian figurines again. He mentioned that he'd written to the museum." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "He had?" "Yes. He felt the time had come to entrust the collection to a national institution. I didn't press him, it was a personal decision." "And he told you this without prompting?" Dunthorpe hesitated. "He trusted me. I suppose he felt I would understand." Holmes nodded slowly, curious. "You see, Lord Collingwood never sent that letter." Dunthorpe blinked. "What?" "We searched his correspondence. No letter to the British Museum was found, nor was there mention of it in his desk journal. It would appear he changed his mind or never intended to send it." The scholar said nothing. His lips parted, then closed again. Holmes leaned forward. "And yet, you are to inherit the collection." "I didn't ask for that." Dunthorpe stammered. "No," Holmes agreed. "But you certainly benefit." Dunthorpe stood abruptly. "If you are accusing me, I am observing you," Holmes said calmly, "which is quite different." Later, as we made our way back to the inn, I asked, "Do you believe he's the one?" Holmes was silent for a long moment. "He knows more than he says, but I am not yet convinced of his guilt. His discomfort may stem from self-preservation or from guilt by association. And Nellie, she saw something, or overheard it. The timing of her disappearance is too perfect. And now we have evidence burned in the night, and a letter fragment threatening exposure. And the blackmail money." Holmes gave a faint, wry smile. "That, my dear Watson, is the lever. Once we find who received it, the house of cards begins to fall." He paused at the gate of the inn, looking up at the thick gray sky. "There is something deeply rotten beneath this surface civility," he said. "This is no simple crime of inheritance or spite. It is tangled, old perhaps years in the making. and something tells me we've only just begun to uncover it." He turned and pushed open the inn door. Chapter 8. Holmes tests a theory. Holmes had retreated into what I can only describe as a calculating silence. He spent most of the afternoon pacing the confines of our modest room at the White Thistle Inn, his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable, save for a slight narrowing of the eyes that signaled intense concentration. Outside, the sky remained dull and heavy, as though the heavens themselves bore the weight of a secret too vast for words. At last, as I sat by the fire penning some impressions of our investigation thus far, Holmes spoke. "We must displace the surface, Watson. We have circled the facts long enough. It is time to disturb the water and see what lies beneath." I looked up. "You have a theory, then, a possibility, a shape within the smoke. But to catch it, I must provoke a reaction, perhaps several. And how do you propose to do that?" Holmes did not immediately answer. He instead went to his satchel, removing a small stack of envelopes and a bottle of ink. "We shall send out invitations," he said, "carefully worded, each one tailored, each designed to pull a thread and see who flinches." By the following morning, 3 hand-delivered notes had been dispatched to Mr. Dunthorpe, Lady Collingwood, and Henry, the young gardener. Each bore innocuous wording on the surface. Holmes merely requested a short interview at the inn, citing clarification of certain timelines and discrepancies in personal accounts. "Is that true?" I asked, as Holmes sealed the last envelope. "Oh, entirely," he said with a faint smile. "I simply chose not to mention that the timelines I refer to may not be their own." The first interview, Lady Collingwood arrived first, veiled, in black despite the absence of a funeral service. Her posture was elegant, if overly rigid, and her perfume subtle and expensive lingered in the air long after she entered the room. Holmes rose, bowing slightly. "My lady," he said, "thank you for coming. I had little choice." She replied, her voice cool. "Your note suggested I might be hindering the investigation." Holmes gestured for her to sit. I suggested, "Nothing, but there are gaps, Lady Collingwood. Matters of the night in question. I have told Inspector Lestrade everything, doubtless, but your account, while complete on its surface, leaves much to interpretation." She tilted her chin. "Then interpret, Mr. Holmes." Holmes folded his hands. "Your husband drank a cup of tea shortly before retiring. Who prepared it?" "Nellie," she said without hesitation. "And who brought it to him?" "I did." Holmes leaned forward slightly. "Was it his habit to take tea at that hour?" "He often did, especially when reading before bed." "And he read in the study?" "Yes, every evening." Holmes paused. "Forgive the question, Lady Collingwood, but your husband's final hours, do you recall him mentioning receiving a letter that disturbed him?" Her eyes flickered. "A letter? Yes, a fragment was recovered partially burned. It spoke of protection, or rather, the failure of it." The tone was ominous. Lady Collingwood hesitated. "No, he mentioned no such thing to me." Holmes gave the faintest nod. "Thank you, my lady. You've been most helpful." She rose without another word and left as silently as she had come. The second interview, Henry. The gardener Henry arrived with dirt still under his fingernails and a wariness in his step that was at odds with his youthful appearance. His cap was crushed nervously in his hands. "Sir," he said to Holmes with a bow of the head. "Come in, Henry. No need for formality. Sit." He did so uneasily. "You said there were questions." "Simple ones," Holmes said. "You were outside the manor the night Lord Collingwood died, were you not?" "I was in the tool shed, fixing a broken gate hinge." "Until what time?" "Past midnight, sir. I swear it." Holmes tilted his head. "Did you see anyone leave the house or approach from the woods?" Henry frowned. "No, sir. But the fog was thick. I wouldn't have seen my own mother unless she was carrying a lantern. And The back gate was it locked when you arrived? Yes, and open when I left. Holmes leaned back. Tell me about Nellie. Henry shifted in his seat. She was kind, shy, but smart. She saw more than she let on. Did she ever confide in you? Once or twice. Said she heard things. Whispers, arguing at night. Said Lady Collingwood had secrets, big ones. Holmes raised a brow. Did she say what those secrets were? Henry shook his head. No, sir. Just that if anything happened, she'd seen too much already. I thought she was being dramatic, but now his voice faltered. Holmes stood. You've been honest, Henry. I believe you. But I must ask if Nellie trusted you. Why would she run without telling you? Henry looked pained. That's what I don't understand, sir. The third interview. Mr. Dunthorpe entered last, looking harried and impatient. A sheaf of papers tucked under one arm. I must insist this be brief, he said, barely greeting us. Holmes gestured for him to sit. Then I'll be direct. You knew Lord Collingwood was considering donating his collection. Did you advise him against it? Dunthorpe stiffened. Of course not. I respected his decisions. Yet the letter he allegedly wrote to the museum never existed. You mentioned it yourself. That detail is suspicious. I was repeating what he told me, which you accepted uncritically. Dunthorpe's lips thinned. I am a scholar, not a detective. Holmes picked up a page from his notes. You once published a paper on Sumerian tablet authentication. It included methods for falsifying provenance. Yes, to expose forgeries. And if someone needed to sell an artifact privately, say, outside museum channels, such knowledge would prove useful. Dunthorpe rose. If you are accusing me, I am. Once again, only observing, Holmes said calmly. Though your defensiveness is worth noting. The man gathered his papers and left with a slam of the door. When the interviews were over, and the light outside had turned the color of damp slate, Holmes sat in silence by the fire once more. I poured him a glass of brandy. Well, I asked, what did we learn? That fear and guilt wear similar masks, Holmes said. But they do not act the same when pricked. Meaning, Lady Collingwood lies smoothly, but there's a calculation behind its survival. Dunthorpe, however, is hiding something else. I do not yet know what, and Henry may be more honest than anyone in that house. I leaned forward. So what now? Holmes stared into the flames. Now we wait. One of them will react, perhaps soon. And when they do, he stood abruptly, moving to the window. Watson, look. I joined him at the window. A figure was moving hastily through the garden of the manor below, cloaked in a long coat, clutching something close to the chest. The fog had returned, curling about their feet like smoke. Nellie, I breathed. No, Holmes said. Someone else, but they're making a mistake. He turned sharply. Come, Watson. The board has shifted again. Chapter 9. A second attempt. The culprit strikes again. Fog had thickened into a milky shroud. By the time Holmes and I reached the rear gate of Collingwood Manor, the figure we had glimpsed from our window, still faintly visible in silhouette, was slipping past the hedgerow with practiced familiarity. Holmes held a hand to still me as we crouched near the ivy-covered fence. There, he whispered. They are returning to the study wing. I strained my eyes and, through the fog and moonlight, saw a glint of something metallic, perhaps. A key. The figure moved with a deliberate swiftness, not the clumsy panic of a frightened servant, but the purposeful tread of someone who knew precisely where they were going. Who do you think it is? I murmured. Wait, Holmes said. Watch how they carry themselves. No limp, no hesitation. Narrow shoulders, not Dunthorpe. Henry, too tall, and Lady Collingwood would not risk such visibility. The figure disappeared through the garden door. Holmes rose. Come, we'll give them just enough time to believe they're alone. We crept along the flagstone path, boots muffled by moss and wet leaves. Holmes produced a slender pick from his coat pocket and worked the lock of the same door the figure had used. Within seconds, the latch clicked, and we slipped inside. The manor was silent, save for the dull tick of the long case clock in the hallway. Holmes pointed toward the eastern corridor, the study wing. We moved down it in near silence, guided by the faintest light leaking beneath a closed door. A muffled rustling came from within. Holmes placed a hand on the knob, then paused and looked at me. I nodded, heart thumping. He turned the handle slowly, then pushed. The door swung open to reveal a man crouched beside Lord Collingwood's desk, rifling through its lower drawers with gloved hands. Startled, the figure turned toward us, and I recognized him instantly. Inspector Lestrade. Good heavens, I exclaimed, unable to contain my shock. Lestrade stood abruptly, slamming the drawer shut. Watson. Holmes. He looked as though caught stealing a sacred relic. What the devil are you doing here? Holmes stepped forward calmly. I might ask the same of you. Inspector. Lestrade flushed. It's not what it seems. Rarely is, Holmes said, though I find it fascinating that Scotland Yard's presence here was entirely undocumented until now. I returned alone, quietly. Lestrade said, pulling off his gloves. I didn't want to interfere with your line of inquiry, but I've received a message, a most troubling one. Holmes arched an eyebrow. From whom? Lestrade hesitated, then produced a crumpled note from his coat pocket. Anonymous, of course. It stated that key evidence was being concealed in the late Lord's study, something related to the servant girl. I came to verify it myself before making anything official. Holmes took the note and examined it under the desk's reading lamp. I peered over his shoulder. Scrawled in uneven script was the following. She left something behind. The drawer beneath the ledgers. He hid it. Before she ran. She was no thief. Look for the truth before others bury it. Holmes turned the note over. No watermark. Rag paper. Ink inconsistently absorbed. Likely written in haste. With trembling hands. Do you think it's genuine? I asked. Holmes gave a thin smile. I think it is sincere, which is not the same thing as truthful. Holmes, Lestrade said, you know me, I may be a bulldog, but I wouldn't falsify a crime scene. I had to be sure. I believe you, Holmes said mildly, but you've also walked into a trap. Lestrade blinked. Trap, Holmes. Opened the drawer Lestrade had just shut and pointed to the false bottom. He'd already discovered the day before, though he had not mentioned it until now, you see. This drawer has been tampered with recently. Someone was here before you. Inspector. He withdrew a thin leather folder that had not been there when we last examined the room. It was planted. Inside were two items, a brooch bearing the initials EH, and a torn ledger page listing a curious financial transaction and unsanctioned withdrawal of £500, dated to weeks prior to Lord Collingwood's death. Lestrade frowned. That's Nellie's brooch, isn't it? Yes, Holmes replied. Which is precisely the problem. We returned to the inn shortly. Before dawn, the fog now tinged with violet as the first light of morning crept across the hills. Holmes had said little during our walk back, deep in thought, the planted folder tucked under his coat. When we were safely behind closed doors, he placed the folder on the table and turned to me. Watson, he said, the killer is tightening the noose, but not around us, round their own neck. They've misjudged the flow of events. But first we must find Nellie. Chapter 10. The true motive begins to surface. It was just past 7 when Holmes and I returned to Collingwood Manor. The fog had lifted, giving way to a pale, strained light that poured listlessly over the hedgerows. Holmes had pulled low over, his brow and coat collar turned against the damp morning air, walked with unhurried confidence as though some inner certainty now guided his every step. You believe Nellie's disappearance is part of a larger scheme? I said quietly. I do, he replied. A frightened servant girl may flee in panic, But she does not disappear without a trace unless someone ensures she cannot be found. Do you believe she's still alive? Holmes gave no answer at first. Then, in a voice low and grim, yes, but the window is narrowing. We found Lady Collingwood in the breakfast parlor, seated stiffly in a high-backed chair. Her hair was already immaculately arranged, though her face bore the faint pallor of a restless night. Before her, untouched, was a plate of cold poached eggs and dry toast. My lady. Holmes greeted with the politeness of a solicitor bringing bad news. She looked up, startled. Mr. Holmes, I didn't expect you so early. I seldom wait for an invitation where murder is concerned, he said with a faint smile. Might we speak privately? She hesitated, but gestured toward the adjoining sitting room. Once inside, Holmes closed the door behind us and said with quiet precision, Lady Collingwood, we've come upon evidence suggesting the supposed theft that led to Nellie's dismissal may have been orchestrated. Her eyes flashed. That's a serious accusation. It is not an accusation, merely a growing suspicion. Holmes replied calmly, the brooch allegedly stolen by Nellie has reappeared placed in your late husband's study, along with forged documents. Her mouth parted slightly, then shut again. We believe, Holmes continued, that someone is attempting to manipulate the narrative in order to conceal the true motive behind Lord Collingwood's death. She folded her hands tightly. You think this child is somehow connected to his murder? I believe she saw something, or knew something she wasn't meant to. Her voice dropped to a whisper. There's something you don't know, something none of us ever discussed, about Edward. Lady Collingwood stood and walked slowly to the fireplace, her back to us. Edward, she began, had enemies, but not in the way you think. He was a complicated man, brilliant, charismatic, but cruel in his own subtle ways. People admired him, envied him, but no one truly loved him, not even Henry. She turned then, eyes rimmed with fatigue. 3 months ago, Edward received a letter from someone we'd not heard from in years, Margaret Winslow, a name you likely do not recognize, but I assure you, her return to our lives was no coincidence. Holmes' eyes narrowed. Go on. Margaret was a maid here 15 years ago. She left suddenly, under scandalous circumstances. She and Edward had an inappropriate connection. He sent her away, paid her off. I thought it was behind us. And now she wrote to say she had a daughter, 17, that she'd fallen on hard times. She hinted at blackmail, though never used the word. Edward, of course, dismissed it, said the woman was mad. But I think he was afraid, truly afraid. Holmes gave a slow nod. You believe Nellie was that child? I don't know. Lady Collingwood whispered. I never saw the girl up close. Edward insisted all the new hires be vetted personally by Dunthorpe. I didn't connect the name. Hargrove is common enough, but the timing aligns. I murmured. Yes, Holmes said. It does. And it offers something we have not yet had in this case, a motive worth killing for. We left Lady Collingwood soon after, and Holmes was silent for some time as we returned to the village. What are you thinking? I asked as we walked past the old chapel and the ironwork gates that framed the village square. I am thinking, Holmes said slowly, that the death of Edward Collingwood was never about love, or money, or even vengeance. It was about history buried, shameful history, and a truth that someone could not allow to resurface. Did she ever mention Margaret Winslow? Clara's brow furrowed. She didn't. But she spoke often of her mother, said she was ill, and they'd been apart a long time. Holmes' expression darkened. Did she say where she was sending the letters? No address. But she said she trusted the man at the inn, Mr. Tolliver. Said he handled quiet postings for a fee. Holmes straightened. Then our next stop is clear. By the time we reached Tolliver's inn, the hour was late morning. and the first coach of the day was arriving with its usual racket. We found the innkeeper behind the bar, polishing glasses with more enthusiasm than necessity. Holmes wasted no time. "Mr. Tolliver," he said, "do you recall sending letters to London on behalf of a servant girl named Nellie Hargrove?" Tolliver blinked, clearly unsure whether to lie. Now, I don't recall every piece of post. She paid you in silver, always exact change. The envelopes were sealed in dark red wax, and you used the backroom ledger to record the outgoing. Time for discretion. Shall I go on?" Tolliver sighed. "All right. Yes, I remember. She was frightened. Said if anyone asked. I was never to tell, but I suppose it's past that now. Where did the letters go?" "She used the address of a boarding house in Kensington for a woman named M. Winslow." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Then the link is confirmed. Do you still have the ledger?" I asked. Tolliver nodded and disappeared into the back. When he returned, he handed Holmes the book. "Open to the appropriate page. For entries. One every Tuesday. The last one, dated the morning before Lord Collingwood's death." She tried to speak. Holmes murmured, tracing the line with his finger, and someone silenced her. Chapter 11. The bait. Holmes' grand strategy. Holmes and I left Tolliver's in under a low and brooding sky. The wind had picked up, sending brittle leaves skipping across the cobbled square. Holmes walked quickly, his gaze distant, his hands behind his back, a sure sign that his mind was racing ahead, piecing together fragments with relentless precision. "I believe the board is set," he said at last, pausing beneath the iron-wrought sign of the apothecary. "You've drawn your conclusion?" I asked. "Not quite, but I've discerned the shape of the truth. Now I must tempt it into full view." He turned to me then, eyes gleaming with a quiet intensity. "We must move quickly. I need to rattle the cage. Let us return to the manor." The Collingwood manor loomed ahead, its gray stone now streaked with the day's gathering mist. Inside, the great halls were silent. Servants moved like whispers. Holmes asked for Inspector Lestrade and was told he had departed for London, leaving behind a junior constable who now stood watch near the study. Holmes waved the man aside. "Watson," he said softly, closing the door behind us, "I believe it is time to test a theory." He crossed to the writing desk, where Lord Collingwood's papers had been stacked meticulously arranged after our first inspection. Holmes opened the lower drawer, removed a sealed envelope, and turned it over, unopened. He said, "The last letter Edward ever wrote, addressed to a solicitor in Belgravia. Curiously heavy." He cracked the seal, removing the contents with the delicacy of a surgeon. Inside were 2 sheets of thick parchment and a folded check. "Payment," he said, examining the check, "a sizable one. For whom?" He held up the letter for me to read. "To Mr. Alphonse Reeve, ESQ, solicitor, Belgravia, L. Hargrove, boarding school." He held it up to the light. "Watson, our girl was educated. That much is now certain. Her poverty was a disguise. Why pretend to be a simple maid? To get close, to observe, to gather proof, perhaps, to confront her father not with threats, but with knowledge, a game of chess, not violence." But the killer turned the board. As the sun dipped behind the trees, casting Collingwood Manor in long shadows, the household gathered in the drawing room. Lady Collingwood sat pale and composed near the fire. Henry paced by the window, his expression unreadable. Dunthorpe arrived last, offering a stiff nod as he entered. "Ladies and gentlemen," Holmes began, standing before the hearth, "you've all been most cooperative during this tragic investigation. But the time has come for answers, and to gather those, I must extend an unusual invitation." He lifted the parcel from the table and placed it beside the fire. "In this box is a copy of a letter Lord Collingwood wrote just before his death. It confirms that he intended to pay Margaret Winslow in full and sever all further contact. He hoped, perhaps foolishly, that money would bury the past. Henry Collingwood frowned. "Why are you showing us this?" "I'm not," Holmes said. "I'm merely stating that the letter exists. The box is sealed and will remain so. But whoever fears its contents most will act." Dunthorpe scoffed. "This is a circus, perhaps," Holmes said lightly. "But when thieves are in the tent, one must think like a ringmaster." He bowed slightly, then motioned to Watson and exited the room. We took up position in the corridor just outside, leaving the firelit drawing room behind. "What now?" I asked in a whisper. "Now," Holmes said, "we wait for the hand that cannot resist extinguishing its own guilt." We had not long to wait. The hallway remained silent for several minutes. Then the door creaked open, and a figure stepped out, slim, quick, dressed in dark gray. Holmes motioned for stillness. The figure turned left away from the servants' stairs and entered the library. A moment later, the scent of paraffin filled the air. Holmes moved like a whisper, slipping into the room with me close behind. Dunthorpe stood before the hearth, the parcel of documents in hand. A match struck and trembling in his fingers. "Mr. Dunthorpe," Holmes said calmly, "if you drop that match, you shall be guilty not only of obstruction, but of unpardonable cowardice." The solicitor froze. Holmes stepped forward. "You feared what was in the letter, because you knew the truth already. You were there the night Margaret Winslow was dismissed, were you not?" Dunthorpe's face drained of color. "You knew about the child. You helped bury the scandal. You saw the girl return not as a maid, but as a witness. And when Collingwood attempted to finally acknowledge her privately, quietly, you panicked, because her presence threatened to reveal what you had kept hidden all these years." Dunthorpe dropped the match. It hissed on the stone floor. "I didn't mean to kill him," he murmured. Holmes stepped closer. "But you did." Chapter 12. The moment of recognition. There was a long silence after the match sizzled out upon the stone. Holmes remained still as a statue, while Dunthorpe slowly backed away from the hearth. The packet of letters still clutched in his hand as though it had grown heavy with the weight of his conscience. "I did not strike the blow," Dunthorpe said, his voice breaking like old timber. "I never meant harm." Holmes' expression did not soften. "Intent is a luxury, Mr. Dunthorpe. It cannot resurrect the dead." The solicitor looked exhausted, an ashen man in a well-pressed suit, crumbling at the edges. "Speak," Holmes said, quietly but firmly. "Let us hear how far your hands have wandered from the law they once upheld." Art of timing. He turned suddenly and looked at me. Double quotes Watson. "Do you remember the position of the cup?" I blinked. "On the desk, near his right elbow." "Indeed. But Edward Collingwood was left-handed. You saw him write, did you not?" Yes, of course. He held his pen in his left hand. Always has." Holmes' gaze sharpened. "And yet the cup bore a right-hand reach. A small detail, but revealing. Someone set the scene after the fact. Someone who didn't know or didn't care how subtle the truth can be." Holmes walked to the window, pulling aside the curtain, just enough to peer into the evening. "She followed Margaret Winslow," he said suddenly, almost to himself. "I watched her confront her father, overheard what she planned. And when Lord Collingwood wrote the letter to end it, she struck, quietly, without mess, a teacup, a tincture, a swift end." He turned to Dunthorpe. "You know who it was. So, do the first, but the question is, why did you try to protect her?" Dunthorpe hesitated a moment longer and then his voice cracked. "Because she threatened me too," he said she would tell everything, that I was part of it all. She would have ruined me." Holmes sighed. "So rather than seek justice, you preserve your reputation." The solicitor looked away. As Holmes gathered his notes and the letter into his pocketbook. "I ventured, so you know the killer now." Holmes gave me a rare, sorrowful smile. I have suspected the truth since I first observed her eyes at the breakfast table. They held not grief, but fury carefully disguised. I caught my breath. You don't mean yes? Holmes said, we must speak with Lady Collingwood. The lady was found in her private parlor, seated beneath a portrait of her late husband. She looked up calmly as we entered. Is it over? She asked. Holmes closed the door behind him. That depends, my lady, he said. Will you help us? Bring the curtain down, or must we let the evidence do so for you? She tilted her head. Expression unreadable. You think I killed him? No, Holmes said. I know you did. Her silence was more damning than any confession. Holmes continued, voice quiet and precise. You knew about the girl long before Margaret arrived. You found the letters years ago. You saw the signs, but Edward had shut his eyes to his past, and so you bided your time. You're mistaken, she said, though her voice had grown colder. Holmes shook his head. When Margaret returned, not as a stranger, but as a threat to your legacy, you saw the whole edifice your family name, your son's inheritance, your social standing on the brink of collapse. And so, on that final morning, you brewed the tea. She flinched, not with poison, Holmes continued, but with a strong tincture derived from digitalis, a clever choice, quick acting in high doses, but subtle. You timed it precisely to follow the quarrel, so that suspicion would fall elsewhere. Her eyes glittered. You have no proof. Holmes smiled. Proof is for the court, but logic is for me. We left her alone, as she requested, to prepare herself. Holmes and I stood on the terrace, the fog curling around our feet like slow-moving smoke. Behind us, the great house seemed to exhale, releasing its secrets into the dusk. Do you think she'll confess? I asked. Holmes did not answer at first. Then, quietly, a woman like Lady Collingwood would rather fall on her sword than be dragged into the light. And indeed, when the police returned at Holmes' summons an hour later, they found her seated still in the chair, composed, calm and dead. A crystal flask of laudanum rested on the table beside her. A single page of writing lay near her hand. Chapter 13. The final attempt to escape. Page beside Lady Collingwood's lifeless hand bore neither confession nor apology. It was a simple note, neatly written in her immaculate hand. Better a quiet end than a public unraveling. Edward never knew what monsters he let in. Let history be kind to those who remain. AC. It was not the admission Holmes might have hoped for, but it was enough. Enough to close a chapter, but not the story, if or even in death. Lady Collingwood had left behind shadows that did not easily retreat. We stayed at the manor that night, Holmes unusually quiet, his violin untouched. By the bedside, the case had resolved. Technically, the death of Lord Collingwood had been avenged in the abstract. The guilty had perished by their own hand. The secrets were unearthed, and the legacy left behind was as fractured as the mirror in the study, but something in Holmes' demeanor betrayed unease. It was well past midnight when I found him in the library, seated in the same chair where we had questioned Dunthorpe. The fire had died to smoldering embers. I still hear a step behind me, Holmes said without looking up, as though the curtain closed quickly. Watson, something remains unfinished. You think someone else was involved? I asked. He shook his head. Not involved, but aware. She lied to you. Fairfax looked up, stricken. She told you Margaret Winslow was a fraud, Holmes said gently, but the letters were genuine. Collingwood himself confirmed it. You were used. Fairfax's composure wavered for the first time. His face crumpled not with guilt, but with grief. I never knew, he whispered. We left the sunroom in silence. The butler did not attempt to flee. When the constable arrived that afternoon, he walked out with dignity, head held high, as though escorting himself to a funeral. Holmes stood in the hallway, watching him go. Would you have told him? I asked, if she hadn't died first. Holmes's expression darkened. I would have. But he was already ruined. Lady Collingwood didn't just poison her husband, she poisoned every loyalty around her. By evening, the estate had resumed its silence. Margaret Winslow, no longer a name whispered in the shadows, was to be contacted by Dunthorpe and informed of her inheritance, as stated in the original letter Edward Collingwood had written. Holmes insisted on it. She deserves that much, he said. And what will she do with it? I asked. Holmes looked away. That, Watson, is her mystery now. As our carriage rattled away from the Collingwood estate the next morning, the fog lifted briefly over the hills. Holmes leaned back, hands folded. A tidy ending. I asked. Holmes shook his head. No, Watson, but a truthful one. And sometimes, that is the best we can hope for. I looked once more at the manor disappearing into the morning mist, and I could not help but feel that beneath its polished floors and ancestral portraits, it would always be haunted not by ghosts, but by secrets that nearly got away. Chapter 14. Truth on Paper. Ash in the Hearth train rocked gently as it pulled away from the Ashcroft station, fields blurring into streaks of green and gold. Holmes sat opposite me in the compartment, his eyes fixed on nothing, his fingers steepled in his familiar pose of inward concentration. He had barely spoken since we left the Collingwood estate, but I could sense it. He wasn't done. Not with the case, not with the aftermath, not with the woman who had vanished into legend before Holmes could look her squarely in the eye. Margaret Winslow, I said, watching the countryside retreat. Do you think she'll ever return to the manor? Holmes blinked, coming back to the present. He didn't answer at once. She may never return physically, he said at last. But that house now bears her shape. Her father's letter, once buried beneath floorboards in shame, will echo through its corridors long after her footsteps are gone. We arrived in London the next morning, and for a while, the city's rhythm swallowed us. Routine returned. Holmes took on two minor cases, one involving forged art, the other a disputed will. But I could tell he was merely occupying time. Then, one gray afternoon, he summoned me to Baker Street with a telegram clutched in hand. It was from Dunthorpe. Miss Winslow arrived, accepted letter, no questions, declined inheritance, left. Before dinner, destination unknown. I looked at Holmes. She declined? I said, incredulous. Holmes nodded slowly. She came all that way, I continued, to receive proof that she was Collingwood's daughter. And then she walked away. Holmes stood, moved to the window, and stared down at the street below. She didn't come for the estate, Watson. She came for truth. Later that evening, I found him in his study surrounded by papers, letters from Lady Collingwood, the half-burned correspondence recovered from the hearth, the reconstructed portions of Edward Collingwood's final note. Holmes had arranged them in sequence, as though assembling the pages of a ghost-written book. He motioned for me to sit. Let us consider, he said, not the deaths but the narrative. Chapter 15. The letter she never sent. While weeks passed in uneasy quiet, London's fog hung thicker that season, a damp curtain drawn over the streets of Baker Street. Holmes had taken to long, silent walks in the evening, declining even his beloved pipe. I knew that when he withdrew in such a manner, it was not from lack of stimulation, but rather from the weight of unresolved thought. A truth still nagged him, elusive yet near. Then one morning, Mrs. Hudson brought in a cream-colored envelope, slightly weather-worn and addressed in a delicate, looping script, Mr. Sherlock Holmes to 1B Baker Street, London. Return address. No crest. Holmes opened it with a flick of his letter opener, revealing a single page folded 3 times. As he read, his eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but in a rare flicker of sorrow. He passed it silently to me. Holmes, you once asked if I had written to him before I arrived. I had not, but I did write. I just never sent it. I've enclosed it here not for evidence, not for record, but because I believe you understand what it means to live in the shadow of truth. Unacknowledged, I do not know where I am going next. Perhaps I'll find a place not ruled by names or titles. Perhaps I'll live quietly, among books or trees or people who never heard of the Collingwoods. Please do not come after me. You already found what needed finding. M. Holmes set the first page aside. Tucked within was a second sheet, folded twice and clearly older, the ink slightly faded, the edges worn. I unfolded it and began to read. Dear sir, you do not know me. Or rather, you do, but not as I am now. My name is Margaret Winslow. I was born in the spring of 1867, in a house on Alder Lane in Sussex. My mother was Eliza Winslow. She died when I was 11. On the day of her burial, I found a small tin box. In her dresser, inside was a letter, unsigned, and a pressed sprig of rosemary. The letter said only this: "She has my eyes. Keep her safe. I cannot." I spent the next decade trying not to wonder who wrote it, and then another 5 years trying to discover who did. I believe it was you. I make no demands of you. I seek no reparation. I do not want the house, the title, or the name. I only want to know if it's true. If you have loved your family truly and wish to protect them, I understand. I will not come unannounced or cause scandal. But if it is within your soul to acknowledge me even quietly, I ask only this: please write back. I do not wish to disturb your life. I only want to know if I came from something real. Yours, Margaret. I finished the letter with trembling fingers. Holmes sat very still. This, I murmured. She never sent this. He shook his head. No. She carried it, likely for years. The pain in the letter was unmistakable. Not rage, not even longing, but a kind of restrained, exhausted dignity. The sort of ache born not from abandonment, but from almost being accepted. Holmes took the letter back, studying it not as evidence, but as something sacred. She wrote this before the visit, I said. Clearly, Holmes replied. And yet, she left it unsent. Perhaps she hoped he would recognize her without it. Perhaps she hoped he'd say the words himself. But he never did, I said. He left only the note we found, and the flower. Holmes stood, moved to the fire, and stared into the glowing coals. No, he said quietly. But the note, the final message we received, he wrote that before she arrived. Watson, before he ever laid eyes on her. What are you suggesting? That he knew she was coming? That someone, likely a family servant, or perhaps one of the old stewards, recognized her, told him? Or perhaps he knew from the moment the letter was handed to him and never admitted it? He turned back to me. She never gave him that letter, Watson. But she didn't have to. That afternoon, Holmes penned a brief response. Not to Margaret. He respected her request not to follow, but to DUNTHORPE. Dear Reverend, please find enclosed a copy of a letter never sent. I believe it belongs in the estate archives, not for legal purposes, but for the moral record. What we inherit is not always land or title. Sometimes we inherit silence. That silence should not be passed to the next generation. With respect, S.H. He sealed it, wax and all, and sent it with his fastest boy. The following morning, he returned to his violin. He played not his usual storm of Bach or Vivaldi, but a gentle folk melody I did not recognize, slow, haunting, and laced with a tenderness I had rarely heard in his music. Where did you learn that tune? I asked softly. He did not stop playing, only said, it was written in the margins of her letter. I did not press further. In the weeks that followed, Holmes seemed lighter, somehow. Not joyous, he was never that, but quieter in his contentment. He took no new cases. For a time, we simply lived. It struck me, then, that for all his brilliance, Holmes was not merely a man of logic. He was, in the deepest parts of his soul, a seeker of truths that matter, the kind that heal as much as they expose. And Margaret Winslow, in her quiet refusal to claim vengeance or power, had given him one of the purest truths he had ever uncovered. Chapter 16. The Teacup, the Knife, and the Truth between them. It was an overcast morning in early February when Holmes turned to me, eyes glittering over his breakfast, and said, "It's time." He had spoken scarcely a word in days, not out of detachment, but because something had finally settled within him. Not resolution, no. Holmes rarely resolved things emotionally, but understanding. That dangerous and holy kind of knowledge he always pursued to the very end. I set down my coffee. Time for what? He gave a faint smile. To unbraid the knot. We returned to the Dunthorpe estate by afternoon. The grounds were still quiet, though the trees no longer held the same secrets. The house had become a shell of implications, but it wasn't the past Holmes had come for this time. Reverend Dunthorpe met us at the side door, his coat half buttoned, and a troubled line between his brows. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted, "you said you had further clarity?" He flipped to the next page. February 6th. Requisition of kitchen knives replaced. Small paring knife reported missing. Holmes straightened. The blade was not taken by a thief. It was taken by someone within the house. We sat by the fire while Holmes unfolded the full shape of the thing. Margaret never intended harm. She came with that letter in her coat, hoping foolishly or not for something akin to recognition. But what she did not know was that another already suspected the truth. One of the household. Who? I asked. L.B., Holmes said. Lydia Burnham, the housemaid. She served Lady Collingwood since girlhood. She'd have known every movement in the estate, who came, who stayed, and who looked like someone they shouldn't resemble. And she recognized Margaret, I said. More than that, Holmes replied. She feared what her presence meant. You recall Lady Collingwood was abroad during Margaret's visit. Yes, visiting a sister, I believe. She left in haste, Watson. I believe Lydia urged her to go. And in her absence, Lydia took matters into her own hands. It was clear to Holmes now that the tea had been drugged not by Margaret, but by Lydia. She meant only to disorient him, to force a confession, perhaps, or frighten him. The teacup was a lure. Holmes stood, drawing it out in midair with ghost-like precision. She likely placed the teacup while Margaret was outside, drugged it, and left the study door unlatched. Margaret walks in, finds her father unconscious or perhaps barely conscious, a knife nearby, a message scrawled and left on the desk. But then the wound, I asked, that shallow cut, not self-inflicted. No, Holmes said, staged. He led us to the sitting room where the desk had been. Holmes crouched by the corner where the carpet was slightly darker. Blood, he whispered, not from an accident, but from a purpose. He rose. Someone pricked his shoulder with the knife after death, not to disguise the cause. It would never fool a medical examiner, but to dramatize it, to make it look like penance, a staged act of guilt. And the paper? I asked. Holmes was silent for a long moment. He wrote that note. He said at last, I believe he wrote it, of his own volition. He knew she would come, and he wished to say goodbye in the only way a man like that could. We stood then in silence, the echoes of the dead lingering around us. A portrait of Lord Collingwood stared from the mantel. Holmes regarded it with a peculiar look, one part scorn, another part empathy. He feared her, Holmes murmured, not because she was dangerous, but because she embodied a past he thought he buried. He knew the truth would outlive him. Back in Baker Street that evening, Holmes sat at the window, watching the lights flicker along the foggy streets. You once asked me, Watson, he said, if truth always prevails. I nodded slowly. You said it prefers shadows. He smiled, faintly, yes, and sometimes it prefers teacups. I frowned. What will become of her? She will disappear, he said, as she wished, but not into oblivion, into her own making. He tapped the desk. She did not kill him, but she did bury him in the only way that matters, by confronting the man who made her and choosing not to become him. Chapter 17. The final deduction. Why it could only be her. Holmes had barely slept. I knew this not because he told me he rarely did, but because I could hear him. The scratch of his violin long past midnight. The clink of glass when he poured another to fingers of brandy he didn't finish. The low rustle of paper as he leafed through something he had read a dozen times before, trying to feel what it refused to give. That morning, I found him staring at the street below as fog coiled around the gas lamps like smoke from an invisible fire. She didn't kill him, I said softly. You proved that. So what troubles you? Holmes didn't turn. The same thing that always does, Watson. What's that? He glanced at me now, eyes grave. What the truth cost her to survive it. We returned to Scotland Yard at noon. Lestrade was waiting, arms crossed, impatience obvious. I don't like the look of this, Holmes, he said immediately. This whole case smells like theater. A man dead, a missing girl, a servant gone, without resignation, and not a single arrest. You prefer easy puzzles, Holmes replied coolly, because they preserve your sense of order. But order, Inspector, is not the same as justice. Lestrade bristled. Then give me something I can use, something solid. Holmes reached into his coat and produced a single slip of paper. It was the missing letter. Not the torn half Margaret left behind, but the original, the full correspondence. I had it sent anonymously, Holmes said, to a man who could be trusted with neither its meaning nor its consequence. He kept it hidden for decades. Unaware of what it contained, Lestrade took it and scanned the writing, his brow furrowing deeper as he read. My dearest Anna, I have tried to live in silence, but silence no longer offers me peace. There is a child, and she is mine. I fear what that makes of me, and yet I fear more what silence makes of her. See, Lestrade exhaled. So he admitted it. Yes, Holmes said, not to the courts, not to his wife, but to someone who might one day understand the confession for what it was a request for. Forgiveness, not from the world, but from the past, outside the yard. Holmes lit a cigarette and began walking aimlessly, hands in his coat. She didn't need vengeance, he murmured. That's what everyone assumes, that children born of ruin grow up hungry for blood. But she didn't want revenge. She wanted recognition. I finished. Holmes stopped walking. His gaze was distant. She wanted to be named, and in that desire, Holmes finally found what had been gnawing at him. She had the motive, Holmes said later. Pacing across our sitting room, she had the opportunity, and yet she chose restraint every single time. That is the final deduction, Watson. That it could only be her. Yes, Holmes said, turning to me. Only Margaret could have stood in that room, faced the man who denied her existence, and walked away. He paused. And only someone who truly feared what she represented would construct such an elaborate scene to frame her in shadow. I frowned. You still believe Lydia Burnham was responsible for the staging? In part, Holmes said. But not alone. She had help. From who? He turned his gaze toward the open window, where the bells of St. Dunstan's tolled. From the one person who had the most to lose if Margaret was acknowledged. It struck me like a cold knife. Lady Collingwood, I whispered. Holmes nodded once. She knew. Not from the beginning, perhaps, but soon enough. The resemblance, the dates. A woman like her doesn't live in ignorance, she lives in avoidance. But when Margaret arrived with that letter, the illusion fractured. But she wasn't even present. She was, Holmes said quietly. I believe Lydia lied on her behalf. She never left for her sister's estate. She remained on the grounds, hidden in the north wing, waiting for the confrontation to play out. I sat in stunned silence. Why? Because she needed to see it, needed to confirm what she feared. And when the confrontation ended not with violence, but silence, she acted. I took the knife, opened the wound, staged the scene, and vanished back into her absence. There was one more place Holmes needed to go. The Collingwood mausoleum stood on a hill shrouded in mist. A wrought iron gate, cold and creaking, led to a stone chamber beneath a weeping willow. Inside, the air smelled of chalk and earth. Holmes knelt beside the central crypt and placed something small and delicate on the lid. A broken teacup. Not the original, this was a replica. But it bore the same crack, the same delicate gold rim, the same fracture down the center. Ceremony. He whispered, "It matters more than people think." He stood, his face unreadable. "She will go far, Watson. This is Margaret. Not because she is free from pain, but because she walked through it without turning to fire." On the train back to London, Holmes was unusually quiet. The countryside passed in streaks of pale green and gray. I watched him for a time before finally asking, "Will you write to her?" He shook his head slowly. "Or no." He said, "She does not need my words. She already wrote her ending." And then, almost too softly to hear, he added, "Not all wounds bleed. Some grow wildflowers." Chapter 18. A name etched in Fodget was several days before I saw Holmes again. Baker Street had settled back into its usual rhythm of pipe smoke, clattering hooves, and distant bells tolling noon. But something was quieter in him, not diminished, never that, but quieter, like a violin retuned after a long, discordant song. I found him not at his desk, but in the sitting room window seat, watching the clouds roll above the city. The fog's lifting, I remarked, more for something to say than insight. "Yes," Holmes said, barely moving, "but the questions remain." "What questions?" He tapped a finger against his temple. "Why she left the knife untouched. Why she burned the dress, but not the letter. Why she returned to that house after everything. You think it means something more. It always does, Watson. The smallest things always carry the deepest weight. The final puzzle lay not in what Margaret had done, but in what she hadn't. Most suspects act with panic or guilt, but Margaret Collingwood had been precise, intentional. She hadn't fled after the murder. She hadn't tried to lie. In fact, she had left behind just enough truth to be found. But not all of it. Holmes retrieved the broken teacup once more from the mantel. It had been glued together carefully, reverently. The gold inlay matched perfectly, except for one small deviation. "There," Holmes said, pointing to the base. "Look at the glaze." I squinted. "It's been scorched, not by fire," he murmured. "By acid. Just a trace, enough to alter the gloss, but not the structure." "Why would that matter?" "Because this isn't the original cup," Holmes said. "It's a replica, a second one. The true teacup was destroyed long before the night of the murder. This was placed. Why? To rewrite the memory, to anchor it." It was then Holmes explained the final piece. Margaret hadn't just discovered her origin. She had known it for years. The letter was not a revelation. It was a relic, one she had recovered from her mother's belongings long ago, long before Lydia found her in London. Her return to the estate wasn't spontaneous. It was deliberate. She didn't go to confront her father. She went to witness his death. But she didn't kill him. I protested. "No," Holmes said. "And yet, she allowed it." I sat back, chilled. She knew Lady Collingwood couldn't bear the truth becoming public. She knew the shock would shatter the household. But most of all, she knew Lydia, loyal Lydia, would do anything to protect what was left of that name. He leaned forward. She brought the truth into the room and waited. And when it combusted, she walked away. Days later, the official story at Scotland Yard closed the case. Sir Charles had died from a sudden heart attack induced by stress, age, and failing health. There was no knife in the report, no letter, no second teacup, just a note about the poor condition of the household, and a daughter, illegitimate, by rumor, who had since vanished from London's public register. Holmes and I knew better. He once told me justice is not always what makes the papers. Sometimes it's what stays buried because that's where it belongs. The last time we spoke of the case, it was over a pot of oolong. I asked Holmes, "Do you think she's free now?" He thought a long while. "Free," he repeated. "No. But unshackled, perhaps. Isn't that the same?" "No, Watson. One means she can fly. The other means she can walk. And for someone like Margaret, walking away was the greatest act of freedom she could claim." I lifted my cup to walking. Then Holmes clinked his cup gently against mine. "To those who carry silence as their sword." We received a letter weeks later. No name, no return address, just a pressed violet tucked between the pages, and a single line written in delicate, looping script. "I am not what they named me. I am what I chose to leave behind." Holmes stared at the note for a long time. He didn't speak. He simply folded it, placed it inside his violin case, and played until the light faded from the windows. The fog never returned that evening, but somehow the silence felt deeper.